My warmest possible greetings to my colleagues from the Philippines, who I believe I've met not on one, not two, but three continents. In Europe at the Vienna Conference, later in Japan, and still a year or two later in New Zealand, all at conferences from the Mixed Methods International Research Association. I'm really delighted to be here today to talk to you about mixed methods and how you can launch conversations that cross disciplines as well as methodology. And I'm really basing my argument on the proposal that you want to begin these conversations first with why you use mixed methods. Give people a reason that it's important to use, and then secondarily to move to design issues. I first started teaching mixed methods when I was working in a faculty position in the Center for Disciplinary Studies in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences at Virginia Tech, where I work. And I learned firsthand in that center, which was a partnership of 8 different programs, how difficult it is to talk across different levels of expertise, different types of expertise, different research methods, how difficult it is to find a common language. And without a common language, it's really easy, even in a research project, for people to do what I call parallel play. People who've had young children know that language, parallel play. It's people sort of carve out a hunk and they do their piece of a project and someone else does another piece of the project, but they never really come together and try to combine their knowledge or mix their knowledge, we would say, in mixed methods. So terminology is often a big obstacle to talking across disciplines. The language of a mixed method way of thinking, that's a phrase coined by Jennifer Greene in this book, who I'm showing the cover of, is one way to begin this cross-disciplinary dialogue. She describes a mixed method way of thinking this way, as it respects and actively embraces multiple philosophical and theoretical stances on knowledge and legitimizes multiple and diverse ways of knowing. And you can read the rest. But this statement of a mixed method, this description of a mixed method way of thinking is many things simultaneously. It's a theory, it's a theoretical framework for research. It can define your purpose. It has some implications for paradigm, and it's also associated with elements of research design and elements of quality. Namely, it's related to 2 concepts that are recognized widely across disciplines, and those are validity and triangulation. So let's look first at these 2 pieces of terminology, triangulation and then validity, that are so linked to quality. And their advantages are that they are linked to quality in all methodologies. It's not just qual, it's not just quant, it's not just mixed methods, it's across all methodology. Now, Greene, Caricelli, and Graham, in a 1989 article that's still very widely cited, identified 5 purposes for mixed methods, and triangulation was one of them, the first one they mentioned, the most commonly recognized. Now, they use a very conventional definition of triangulation here, the idea of it as collecting different types of data or repeated measures, the quantitative people might say, to seek convergence, corroboration, correspondence, similarity. So there's always the boost in confidence about findings when you have more than one point of data or more than one finding to support it. A person very familiar in the qualitative world, Norman Denzin, really a giant in the field, writing almost a decade before Caricelli, Graham, and Greene, really challenge us to think of triangulation as being far more than simply corroborating data, seeking consistency. This is a very quantitative, sort of positivist mindset. He suggested or identified at least 4 forms of triangulation, which you would see paralleled in 4 reasons for triangulating or integrating data for mixing. First, he talks about method mixing, and you see that a good bit in mixed methods. That's when mixed methods is paired with another methodology, like grounded theory or case study. Those are very common. Community action research, evaluation. He refers to that as methodological triangulation. He also refers to data triangulation, which is often what people think of, where you put both your qualitative and mixed methods. You would put your qualitative and quantitative data and line it up, for instance, in a table or joint display. He refers to a third kind, theoretical triangulation, when you're bringing in more than one theoretical framework, and also investigator triangulation. So the important thing about Dudson is to resist this idea that there's only one kind of triangulation, and that's about confirmation, corroboration, and to expand our ideas about triangulation, which really is why we mix. Yet a third person I want to mention who's been influential to my thinking and should be particularly relevant to those of you out there in nursing, Marguerite Sandowski, someone from Chapel Hill in the United States, really links the idea of triangulation, alternative explanations, and validity together in what you could refer to as how you apply a mixed method way of thinking to analysis. She dismisses the idea that you can simply distinguish qual and quant, one as inductive and one as deductive, by suggesting that there's a movement back and forth between induction and deduction as any researcher analyzes the data and begins to try to generate explanations for what they find. And underneath that is this idea, mixed method way of thinking, that you entertain multiple possible explanations. In a classic sense, you would eliminate explanations one by one systematically to come to a final one. And that is a mindset that also works with this idea of a mixed method way of thinking. So let's link a mixed method way of thinking with what is a mixed methods research question. This is the single most common mixed methods research question. What are the similarities and differences between the qualitative and quantitative findings on the same construct generally? You'll find more similarities than differences, and that again we talked about leads to a sense of legitimacy of your data. But those contradictory findings, or those findings that can seem contradictory, often lead to new explanatory insight. Some definitions of mixed methods research assumes that it's always something that is planned ahead of time. But a good bit of mixed methods research is adopted later in the process, particularly in complex problems, in complex projects, when findings are not turning out as might be expected. So 2 examples of those where it really matters can be like an experimental design or funded research where you have received funding to implement, say, an activity or an intervention in a medical context, and you have predicted that this will help lead to that, and then the findings turn out that that's not the case, that you cannot prove that there is a significant relationship. And often mixed methods is brought into that kind of situation, particularly the qualitative, to explain those non-significant findings, to try to see perhaps if there's group differences before that. Another benefit or another time that mixed methods might be used in an unplanned way is it could again be in an intervention when you see that there are not only some positive side effects, but negative side effects, or you may be trying to improve someone's ability to do a math problem, but find instead that it also helps them with their English project, for example. So a lot of times mixed methods is not something that was imagined at the beginning, but can be introduced as something that is helpful when findings are puzzling and you want to try to understand them in ways that might help others. Earlier, I talked about a mixed methods way of thinking as a type of theoretical framework. I mentioned that it can be linked to design, of course, and I've also talked about how it can be linked to purpose and to your research question. But let's consider now how you could embed that theoretical orientation, that paradigmatic orientation, into some elements or all elements of research design. Most people wouldn't use all of these, but when you do, you could refer to it as fully integrated mixed methods research. So we've already talked about framing a mixed methods research question, but now let's look at sources of data, sampling, mixing in general, and analysis. So the mere act of seeking diverse sources of data, unusual sources of data may be a way to put that, could be part of this mixed methods way of thinking that impacts design. Another place you might see it is in sampling itself. If you use, for example, either extreme case sampling or you use maximum variation sampling, for example, in picking cases to examine differences and similarities of groups of students or teachers or nurses in different settings. Sampling is often a place where the mixed methods way of thinking is embedded. We saw in Sandowski this idea of moving back and forth between an inductive exploratory and a deductive confirmatory stance during analysis. This is facilitated when you line your data up in a spreadsheet or database so that you can go back and forth between your quantitative indicator and your qualitative indicator. So maybe your quantitative indicator is about well-being, and maybe you've lined it up with an excerpt from someone that is talking about what they mean by well-being. That's the quality dimension of well-being. What part of well-being are they talking about when they rate their well-being? Finally, we've talked about mixing during analysis or integrating data during analysis in ways that allow you to pursue those confirmatory as well as unexpected or paradoxical findings. So to wrap up with this last slide, let me kind of try to cap the key points I'm making. My first point is that when you're trying to talk across discipline or you're trying to introduce mixed methods to a new audience, the place to start is the reason why they would use it. What can they gain by using it? And I guess I've really pointed to two indicators of quality, triangulation and validity, as very strong reasons to consider mixed methods because of its ability to not only dissect complex phenomena, but to create a broader, more multi-layered concept about it. I've suggested that this mixed method way of thinking is linked to these notions of quality, and it kind of provides a theoretical framework to guide research in that it'll help you establish a purpose. It can guide your research questions. It builds on these notions of quality. And in the slide before, that is when you begin to start talking about design. So it's a tendency in mixed methods to start with design, but that introduces a lot of language sometimes that people find um, off-putting. So beginning with purpose and saying you're engaging different sources of data to try to understand consistency and inconsistency, in other words, to triangulate, is a language that crosses methods, methodologies, subject areas, topics. So it gives you that important common ground to start a conversation.